Badr? Hamza. Hamza. Okay. Okay, Hamza. She's a girl. So she's not here today. Saad?
Yes. Yeah. Actually, both of them didn't know that we had a class today. I didn't know also.
Because
Yeah.
every day we have it
That's
on
right.
one day, and then just suddenly it switched. Every day we have it on Monday and Wednesday.
Yeah.
It's just today that it's
Yeah,
switched.
it's confusing. I know that they prefer not to do this. They know that this happens a lot. No, no, no. I know that at some point
No, no, it's fine.
they had to change the dates. I don't know, to accommodate some people, but
بس هي صدفة وقت
ترى.
يعني سبحان الله.
صوتك
إحنا صباح
كلامك مسجل ها؟
أعطونا سكجول من أول المفروض إحنا نكون حوالي.
yeah.
بس عندك كذا كوهورت هيك.
عندنا
So we just started talking a little bit about financial decisions and how they relate to the value maximization principle that is highly discussed now. We mentioned investment decisions as an example of financial decisions. But other than investment decision, what other financial decision you may think of?
Taking loans.
Taking loans, yes. So this is part of what type of, if we want to categorize financial decisions, we have investment decision, and taking loan would belong to what type of decision?
Financial decision.
It's financing. Actually, financial decision includes any decision that has financial implications. Okay, anything that you do as a business that will have money implications is a financial decision. So you can think of everything as being a financial decision, right? Because anything you do in the business will have some financial implications, right? So if we want to categorize them now, there are, as I said, investment decision, we mentioned them. Taking a loan versus what? So when you say taking a loan, it means that you have sometimes a choice, maybe. Either you will borrow the money or you will
Increase the capital.
increase the capital. So this is how we call it.
Increase the prices.
Public offering.
Commercial.
Sorry?
Public offering.
Public or going through a public offering, for example, yes? So it's the choice is very simple. It's either debt or equity. Okay, either we will invite more shareholders or existing shareholders to put more money. This is equity money, or we will borrow money from outside. This would be debt. So this is the choice, and this is what we call a financing decision. Decision here consists of whether to borrow or not, and if yes, what type of actually equity, what type of debt, because there are different types, and what will be the cost, etc., etc. So this is the type of decision that we are talking about here. We call it financing. We call it also capital structure, because it involves the mix between debt and equity. Whether we have more debt, more equity, is it better, is it not? Of course, if we have the choice again, we have to see the pros and cons of every single decision we make and their implication, their financial implications again. So this is another type of decision. What else?
Buy versus rent. Or is,
This is an investment decision again,
okay.
as I mentioned. It's an example of an investment decision because this involves the type of assets you will have,
Yeah.
right? So it is an investment decision. Any other decisions that we may have to make as a
Okay. Maybe distributing like a profit, distributing
Yeah,
profit
dividends.
or investing it inside the company.
exactly, that's a very good example. It's what we call payout policy. It's okay, how are we gonna distribute the profit if there is any profit? Are we gonna give it back to the shareholder? Are we gonna hold it in the business and reinvest it back in the business? Why is it an important decision here? Because of course, this depends on what actually, whether we distribute or not. Why we have to decide on it? Why we don't simply distribute whatever we make, basically.
It has to adhere to payout policies of the company. It has,
Yes, so we have to set up a payout policy based on what?
Strategy.
Based on the strategy, yes. What will make, in other words, what will make a company distribute versus reinvest internally?
based on profitability
Profitability of
of the company.
the company and
The
most
cash, also
importantly
the-
of
The cash.
sorry of
Going concern.
yes. So it's actually the potential for new investments. If you have great opportunities of growth and investment that will generate more returns for the shareholders than what they would expect, then it's better to reinvest. If you don't have those projects and if you don't have this potential of growth, then you'd better give the money back to the shareholders and let them invest it themselves, right? This is basically the idea. But do you think it always works like this? No. This is the idea. This is what it should be. This is again, this would be consistent with the value maximization if we do this. But we know that in reality, that's not what companies do. Policy, payout policy, sorry, or the distribution of dividends or not, depends on so many other factors. Not only the profitability of future projects or what we mentioned, we will talk about it. So this is again another research topic. What drives the payout policy of a company? What are the factors that matter? Why? What's the role of the governance bodies in this policy setting, etc. So this is another research area that can be very broad also, depending on which perspective you take. So here, I list them as investing. As I said, all businesses have to invest their resources wisely in order to achieve, again, the goal of value maximization, finding the right kind and mix between debt and equity, and returning the cash to the owners if there are not enough good investments. That at least theoretically, but we will see later that there are other factors that matter when it comes to, again, payout policy. When it comes to, we mentioned this for payout policy, now when it comes to choosing the mix between debt and equity, what do you think this depends on? What will make companies prefer to borrow money versus prefer only equity? And what are your thoughts about this? Yeah.
Debt is more risky because if the company liquidates, it has the obligation to pay those loans first before the equity.
Yes. So this is a very specific type of risk that we are talking about here. It depends. When you say debt is risky, it's a certain type of risk. For example, if you think of the debt holders themselves, if you are a stockholder versus a debt holder, which one is more risky? If
For
you are
the holder?
If you are, yeah, for the holder. If you are providing the capital. Equity holders are taking more risk, okay? Because again, it's related also to what you said, because they have a residual claim. We have to pay the debt holders first, and then whatever is left goes to the equity holders. So that's why they have a higher risk, okay? So equity is linked to more risk than debt, but from the perspective of the business, the risk that you are talking about is bankruptcy risk or default risk, okay? Debt is associated to a risk that does not exist when you have only equity, which is bankruptcy risk. We cannot go bankrupt if we have only equity. If we use only our money, we don't go bankrupt. We go bankrupt when we use other people's money, right? When we borrow money. So this is what you're saying from this perspective is true. There is more bankruptcy risk related to debt, and that's maybe one of the reasons, one of the cons, if you want, of having debt. Now, why companies and businesses borrow money? What are the pros of having more debt?
It's easy
to get the money.
It's easy. What do you mean by, is it easy for everybody to borrow money? Not always. If you are a startup, for example, I think it's easier to find maybe people who will invest in your idea, etc., rather than going to a bank and trying to borrow money. If you don't have a land or if you don't have some real assets to give as guarantee, you will not have as a collateral, you will not have any loans. So it can be easy for some companies, yes, to borrow. What are the other motivations why people and businesses borrow money, basically?
Debt, sometimes in some countries, debt is tax deducted, and
the interest is tax deductible.
Yeah.
So there is a tax advantage for debt in countries where you pay taxes, of course, when companies pay taxes. Interest is deducted from the taxable income, so this reduces basically the taxes. That's a very good reason why debt could be maybe preferred. Yes?
What about liquidity?
Liquidity, what?
Like, for example, a company would like to have more cash, cash availability in the company. This is why they tend to.
So they want to keep the cash, you mean?
Yes.
So they would go borrow money in order to keep the cash.
Yes.
The cash that is, you mean here the difference between internal financing versus debt,
Yes,
right?
yes, sometimes.
If I have cash, I want to keep it and go borrow money. What do you think about this? In general, in finance, is it good to keep cash?
No.
Yes, you need it.
Because there is an opportunity cost with keeping cash.
Yes.
But I agree that it provides you with some kind of safety when you have it. We call it like a safety. You have to have like a safety cushion,
Yes.
some amount of cash. But too much cash is not good, is not healthy, because we will talk about it also later from a managerial perspective. Do you think a manager, if you think of a CEO, for example, do you think he will be more efficient if he has a lot of cash or less cash?
Less cash. This is the typical.
More efficient?
More efficient in making decisions.
More cash.
More cash.
More cash.
If you don't have cash, you تقعد كده.
عشان بس نخلق argument.
Salary for whom? I'm talking about the company. I'm talking about making the right decisions for the business. Do you think if you have a company that has a huge cash amount, the CEO will be more efficient or less efficient?
Less efficient.
Less efficient, yes.
Yes.
And this is something we will talk about later. I will explain all this in a moment,
Unless
okay?
he invests a lot on the money, the return is very
I would say it depends on the manager. If he's
That's of course here. Everything depends on something, but we talk in general, okay? Some ideas that we tend to observe and what are the reasons behind them, etc.
Doctor, I think one of the main reasons or main criteria for picking to borrow or to have really will be the status of the company. If you already have a lot of loans, then you may take the other decision.
Yeah.
But
Because the more debt you have, the higher the bankruptcy risk.
yes.
So you reach a point where you don't want to go more than that because bankruptcy risk becomes really imminent and very important. So that's, yes, the amount of debt you already have can be also a factor that determines whether you can offer to go for more debt or not. But in general, why
I
we
think that
prefer...
there's another reason is because if I take debt, the ownership of the company is not diluted.
Yeah, it's a matter of control, yes.
Yeah, if I issue a lot of shares, then the ownership.
You may lose the control, yes, that's one of the reasons. But in general, debt is, there is something called leverage effect related to debt. Why do we borrow money in order to invest, for example? Because
The return
this
on
will
equity.
be this will be worth it if you invest in a project that will generate a higher return than the cost of the debt. So imagine you borrow at 5%, you invest at 10%. There is a leverage effect here that multiplies your return by 2, basically, because it's from 5, you are borrowing at 5, you are investing at 10, and this is not your money, someone else's money. Okay, so it's the leverage effect that brings maybe or makes the debt attractive. But this works as long as you are able to pay the 5%. You see what I mean? Because the 10% is an expected return usually that comes with uncertainty and risk. And the higher the uncertainty of your cash flows, the higher the likelihood maybe that at some point you may not be able to pay those 5%. And this is where problems start, because if even 1 year you are not able to pay, you start having problems and you go in a what we call, you go under distress, and this generates additional cost, and the process of bankruptcy starts. Okay, so this is the idea. The idea is, as long as you are making sure that you borrow money and you generate more, yes, but there is nothing called certainty in finance. Everything is uncertain, and we don't know whether we will be able to generate the 10% that we expected or not, and that's what makes it risky. So these are, if you want, the pros and cons, but there are other dimensions to it that we will mention later. Like what I said, for example, when we talked about cash, we can ask the same question for debt. Would you think that managers would be more efficient in doing what they have to do if they have debt or if they don't have debt? Not personally, but for the corporation, for example. So what do you think? Do you think that debt will improve the performance of managers or make it worse? How they, again, in their decision-making process, are they gonna make the right decisions or not if they have debt versus they don't have? Actually, I'm asking the questions indirectly here, but my questions are related, if you want to formalize it a little bit more, are related to the concept of agency problem. You know about agency problems?
Yeah.
Agency problems are simply the conflicts of interest that exist between managers and shareholders. We are talking about maximizing the value for shareholders, right? That's why you put money in a business, because you want to have more money, basically. So the interest of shareholders is to maximize their wealth. And they hire a manager, supposedly, to do this. We say that they are the principal, and they hire an agent to act on their behalf and to maximize their wealth. But is this always the case? Are managers always acting on the best benefit or the best interest of the shareholders? What is the answer from the real world around us? No. Have you read a little bit about the Carlos Ghosn story? If you haven't, maybe you can Google it. I think it's a very interesting corporate governance case that is going on until now, and it has so many dimensions to it. I found it really, I think I will use it for my course in corporate governance because it covers so many dimensions. Who is Carlos Ghosn, for those who read about it?
Ex-CEO of Nissan.
The
Nissan and
ex-CEO
Renault.
of Renault, Nissan, Mitsubishi. It's an alliance. Actually, he's the CEO of Renault in France, and he was kind of, they formed an alliance with Nissan and Mitsubishi, and at some point he was praised for saving Nissan, because Nissan was sinking and he was the saver of Nissan, and in Japan he was viewed as a god. Astaghfirullah, you know, he was considered as really a very important person. He became a very, very powerful CEO. And from there, of course, there were some problems, financial issues that he got involved in. apparently he was misusing the money of the company, and
This is the cash again.
hmm?
If you have more cash, there is a tendency to use the money in a places
that are not the
that are
right
not-
ones. Exactly. Yeah, this is a good
Yeah.
example. Yes, exactly. And actually, there, as I said, there are so many dimensions to the story, because there is the dimension of having a very powerful CEO. How this creates someone who is uncontrollable somehow, because actually the shareholders he becomes really the most powerful person, and shareholders have no control over him, even though they hired him to act on their best interest. They have no control over him anymore. It raises the issue of corporate governance and the differences in corporate governance, for example, between a country like Japan and a country like France. It's two different worlds. I can tell you that has nothing to do the way they do business, the way their corporate governance works. It's completely different. So having two companies from these two different worlds coming together and being run by one person creates issues and creates corporate governance issues. And this is what happened, because actually, if you don't know about the story, he was again very powerful CEO, and at some point he receives a call or something and telling him that he has this important meeting to attend in Japan. He takes the plane, his private jet, he goes to Japan, and the police is waiting for him in the airport, and they took him directly to jail. So it was, how we call it?
Set up.
Set up, yeah. So he got trapped like this, and he went to jail, and until now he's in jail. He was released, he had to pay a lot of money to get some periods of freedom, and then he goes back to jail every time, etc. So at this particular moment, I think he's still in jail. And of course, the setup was made by the Japanese guys there. He's number two. He's the guy who's working with him directly. And this is again a very typical example of agency problem. Okay, you hire someone to act on the benefit, on the interest, to serve the interest of the shareholders, and they end up serving their own interest, living like a king and having his private jet, and having, apparently he rented, I don't know if you know Paris, the Palais de Versailles, it's like the palace, Versailles Palace. It's a very famous palace in Paris, and he rented this for his second wedding. And he had like a ceremony. There is videos on YouTube. He had like a ceremony. People were wearing they rented costumes, etc., as if they were living in the 18th century.
Second wife?
It's second wife, yeah.
Arabic.
Well,
he divorced.
The blood is still
he's
blood.
originally from Lebanon.
Yeah.
He's
He has
Lebanese.
three
He's
nationalities,
Lebanese,
I think.
but originally he's Lebanese, yeah. So basically, no, I think he divorced the first one, and his second one is not second. Anyway, so this just to tell you, I'm giving you this example because it's an example of agency problem for sure, and having this kind of power that where it leads. So
But
When
what
I
is the
mentioned-
role of the shareholders here?
well, this guy is working for the shareholders, right? Who
Yeah.
hired him? It's a board of director, and the board of director is elected by the shareholders. So it's like I'm working for you, but I am serving my own interest, and I'm having my I'm serving first my interest before the shareholders' interest.
I think they voted for him. They voted for him like blindly because he was the savior of Nisa.
Exactly, he became too powerful. That's the whole story. He
Yeah.
became too powerful, so he could do whatever he wants.
Yeah.
Because he's considered as
The
a
savior.
very good CEO who saved Nissan from bankruptcy, etc., etc. And he was probably a very bright CEO, and he did very good things for both companies. But at some point, he became too powerful, and things started getting out of control. So, so this is an example of what CEOs can do to harm or to destroy value for their shareholders, because now both companies are suffering, especially Renault. The whole alliance is threatened. My brother works for the alliance in Paris, so I know exactly what's going on there. And actually, the whole future of this alliance is threatened now becoming completely
because of one person.
because of one person who became too powerful, probably. And but as I said, there are lots of dimensions to this story. Yeah, I'm not putting all the blame on one person. It's you have to see the thing from a broader perspective. It's the consequence of corporate governance practices, probably, that are not right. It's the consequence also of some also political issues. There are political dimensions to the story, yeah? Because these two companies are very important to both France and Japan, and this guy was trying to have like a merger between the two, and the Japanese were resisted this. They didn't want, because in the Japanese culture, again, we don't want foreigners to get involved in our internal businesses and affairs, etc. So I love this story because there's so many dimensions again: the cultural dimension, the corporate governance dimension, the agency problem, the agency cost. It's everything. We can cover all these dimensions in one case, which is a real case, and it's happening right now. So try to read a little bit about it. It's very interesting. Of course, unfortunate for the people involved, but it's you have to see it as a business case, and you have to see the lessons that we can have from this business case. I think there should be some changes after all this, at least from the Japanese side, the way they run their corporate governance. I think there are some issues. And interestingly, I was reading an article, I didn't have time to dig a lot into it. The guy who set him up, who's number 2, he's now involved in a corruption affair also in Japan. So he set him up for this kind of stories, and now apparently they found him also. They found that he was, and he apologized, saying, yeah, this was at the time of Rosen, that was normal business, and that's how we did business. So this was his excuse, if you want. So it's like when you have a culture of wrongdoing, then everything is allowed and everything is permitted. So basically, that's what he was saying. So this brings me to my question, which is, as I said, when you have debt, do you think managers will do a better job or not? When I say managers, CEOs, etc. So a guy like Carlos Rosen, if he had less cash and more debt, maybe he would be more disciplined. And that's what we say. We say that debt brings discipline to the business. Because if your hands are free, you don't have a lot of debt, you don't have lots of eyes turned into the business, you will maybe have more freedom also to do things that you will not be able to do if you have more debt and less cash, basically. So this is another reason and another maybe way to look into this mix between debt and equity. It's not only about risk and return, it's also from a corporate governance perspective and from an agency problem perspective, that can have also some benefits to the management. Yes.
So, Doctor, now you are telling us that you must have loans to use your cash effectively.
Well, I think at the personal level, honestly, I think that brings me some discipline. Personally, when I don't have debt, I spend my money. I don't worry. I have no how we call it, break to my spending habits. But when I have debt, I know that at the end of the month, if I don't pay my loan, I will get in trouble. So this kind of refrains me from spending maybe in a foolish way. So I think this is the same for managers.
Yeah.
It's exactly the
like
same.
tying
If you
them
have
down.
if the cash is there, and you can throw some here in this project and some here and some here, you will do it. But if you have less cash, and if you have to borrow and if you have to pay this loan, then you have more discipline into your business.
I think
Yes.
it's like tying them down in a way, like you're tying
Exactly,
them,
yeah.
but at the same time, when you tie them, you risk them not flying, right? You want them to fly in the end. You want them to be creative, to do this and that.
Well, yes, I agree, but it's not their. Okay, I don't know how to say it. You are tying them down with debt, but at the same time, as I said, with the leverage effect of debt, you are not preventing them from flying, because with debt you can do lots of things, right?
Okay.
With
Yes.
debt you can borrow money to invest in great projects, and the more risky the projects are, and the more creative, and the more return you will generate. So it's not, it will apply if you will monitor them a lot. For example, this an example of solution that we offer for, if I ask you, for example, how can we reduce the agency problem? Because agency problem means agency cost. It's a cost for the company to have this conflict of interest that we're talking about. The story of Ghosni is an example of costs. They are paying it cash now, right? This is the cost. The cost, we have direct and indirect cost. Direct cost, if again you go and buy a private jet while you don't need it, that's a direct cost of agency, right? Indirect cost is the reputation, the loss of reputation, the impact that it can have on your customers, etc., etc. So if you have this agency problem, how can you solve it? What are the solutions? This is again another area of research. How can we know that these agency problems exist. This is a human nature, we cannot do anything about it. It would be utopic and unrealistic to say no, because sometimes this is very interesting also when I ask this question to my undergraduate students and I tell them about agency problem, they say no, why? The CEO should work in the best interest of the shareholders and they should not do this and this is wrong. But when I ask the same question to MBA or GBA students, they all agree that this is how it works, and this is because they the experience, they know that this is how it works and we cannot do anything about it. This is human nature. If you will always try to protect, it doesn't mean that you should be unethical. Here there is a boundary between agency problem and ethics, business ethics, because you can be doing everything in an ethical way, but trying to maximize your own benefits, right? Because at the end of the day, as a manager, what you care about is also to have your salary and not to lose your job and to have a nice villa and a nice car and etc. So this is not unethical, right? But if this conflicts with the interest of the shareholders, then it becomes problematic for the business. This is the story, basically. Now, how can we reduce these agency problems? How can we solve them, basically, or at least reduce them? What are the solutions that you can see, just to relate to what you said?
Doctor, they make increase the percentage of the income of the CEO from the profits.
From the value, at least, yeah, or the profit. Well, if it's the profit, then this brings us to another problem, because maximizing value is not the same as maximizing profit. If we talk about profit, is it the end of the year profit? If I tell you your bonus will be linked to the end of the year profit as a CEO, what are you gonna do?
Short-term
How
profits.
can you make the profit big? If we're talking about accounting profit is very simple. It's revenues minus expenses. Cut expenses, you will get a higher profit.
It could be all
What
receivables.
expenses you can cut?
Throw the expenses. to
Fire
next year.
people. Fire people.
Or just
What
postpone
else?
the expenses. make it
Postpone the
to next year.
expenses. Shut down the research and development. And all this will increase your profit and will increase your bonus. So here again, you see another issue.
Then leave when the
Profit
company
is
falls.
not, value is not profit.
This is a good plan for 2 years.
And then you leave. Yeah, you look for another place.
Yeah, because usually if you have a contract for 3 or 4 years, okay, you will try to focus on the next 3 or 4 years, maximize the profit, get your bonus, and if people are not happy, you have at least a good cash to go with. So this is again, it is part of the solution, but it's debatable. It's the remuneration of executives. We call it executive compensation. It's also a research topic, by the way. You can choose this if you are interested in. It's a very, hot topic in corporate governance and finance, how to motivate, how to incentivize managers and CEOs to work in the best interest of shareholders. So what kind of executive compensation we should offer them, okay, and how this links to the performance of the company. Having bonuses linked to the profit, I don't think this is the solution, and it's proven that it's not maybe the best way to remunerate CEOs. So what other solutions do we have? What other compensation packages we can offer them? There are lots of creative ways to compensate managers, but I think Rossen probably had like a mix of salary plus bonuses plus stock options, etc. But at the end of the day, it's not enough to prevent them from doing maybe wrong things. So usually we talk about maybe compensation that is tied to the value of the share, for example. If you want them to work towards a more long-term objective rather than a short-term profit, you can tie their compensation, or at least part of their compensation, to the value of the share.
Stock option.
Stock options, for example, or warrants, etc. So in this case, maybe they will act better to maximize the value of the share, and they will make the right decisions in that direction. So it's again a research topic. There are lots of things that have been said and that are still yet to be said about this. I know that companies like Apple, like Google came up with creative ways, innovative ways of remunerating their managers and their employees also. So instead of offering them like regular stock options, they will have very specific ways to remunerate them. Now, is it better? Is it proven to be better or not? This is not yet, I think there is no really strong evidence that shows how we should remunerate executives, and that clearly illustrates that we can prevent them from maybe acting in their own benefits. Monitoring also is one of the solutions. So this is maybe where I link it with what you said, is you will have them, tie them down if you are monitoring them too much. Because sometimes when I ask this question to the students also, I tell them, how can we reduce the agency problem? I hear a lot this, again, especially coming from undergraduate students because they don't have the experience, they would say, hire someone to watch them or to see what they're doing. Or so this will never end because you always hire someone to watch someone else who is watching someone else. And monitoring is not easy also, so maybe through some external audit, etc. And we know all the scandals of external auditing and all these entities. So there are problems everywhere. And when I talk about a problem, think of it as an opportunity for research again. Because when we see a problem as researchers, we see it as an opportunity to look into it deeply and to try to find ways to solve it or try to explain it, etc. So all these problems are opportunities of research. As long as they are not solved, as long as businesses suffer from these problems, we will still do research on these issues and try to find solutions and what are the factors that matter, etc. So this is, again, we are in the introduction. I think I will skip this quickly, and I will just show you the big picture I was talking about so that you put the pieces together. So again, the purpose here is to maximize the value. And here again, you can see an area of research where we argue against this idea of maximizing the value and what alternative we can offer. Okay? How can we cater again to the stakeholders without compromising all what we said? So this is maybe a very important area of research now. And from there, how are we maximizing the value? By making wise investment decisions. So by picking the right investments, you will be able to maximize the value. By finding the right mix between debt and equity, because also the way you finance these investments will have a direct impact on the value. Okay, it will contribute to maximizing the value. And by choosing also the right payout policy, the dividend decision or payout policy at large. So these are the three areas that will create the value for the business. Now, when we say investment decision, what are the components of an investment decision? How do we decide whether we should invest or not? Based on what? Again, we said like criteria like NPV, IRR, etc. But the idea is that you have two things. You have a hurdle rate. A hurdle rate is like your target, what you should what investors expect for this level of risk. So it will be based on the riskiness of the investment. All investments are not equal in terms of risk. So the higher the risk, the higher the return. This is one of the bedrock principles of finance. If you have a higher risk, you need to offer a higher return. And also it depends on the mix between debt and equity that you are using to fund this investment. Even though in finance, we try to separate the two. We make our investment and financing decision in a separate way. So the financing decision will have an impact on the hurdle rate, yes, but we should not make our investment decision based on the sources of funding, because then your decision will be biased actually. So this is one of the components of the investment decision, to find the right hurdle rate and to compare it to the return generated by this project. So the return here, how do we measure the return of the project? It will be based on the cash flows that the project will generate. So here we have to measure our cash flows, the timing, etc. So this is more like a technical approach. I don't see really a lot of research here in the way. It's more like practical actually, how to measure cash flows and how to estimate your hurdle rate, etc. But we can look into the investment area in general. So for example, topics of research related to investments, can you mention a few of them? If we want to focus on investment, some topics of research, some important aspects of this crowdfunding, yeah, it could be. It's part of the investment type of research, yes? Yes.
Microfinance?
Macrofinance, yes. Microfinance, yes. Microfinance, it is I think it's more like the financing decision rather than investment, right?
Yes.
It is more the financing decision, yes.
Yes.
Finding out the reliable hurdle rate for new companies, because I worked for.
It's not easy. Yeah?
It's not easy, and they don't know. They don't know.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is one of the most maybe difficult and problematic inputs in an investment decision, the hurdle rate. What to consider as hurdle rate and how to measure it, etc., is quite difficult, especially for companies that are small or not listed, etc. So it is very important. Yes. How to measure the risk premium, how to measure the riskiness, etc. of the project is not easy. I agree with this. We can also talk about different strategies of investment, of divestment, also when the company decides to divest, spin-offs, mergers and acquisitions. When a business acquires another business, it's an investment decision, right? So all these are part of the investment, the first part, or the first type of decision. Second decision is the financing decision, again, debt versus equity, but again, it's about the mix. What makes us prefer debt versus equity? So here we can look at different factors, as I said, the taxation, the discipline that debt brings to the management, the leverage effect of debt, etc. But we can also think about the type of debt and the type of equity. For example, shall we issue new bonds? How do we go through the process of issuing new bonds, etc.? Shall we issue new stocks? Versus, again, depending on which phase of the life of the company, what opportunities or what possibilities of funding we have will differ. Here we can go through the different types of financing. As we said, venture capital, private equity, crowdfunding, then going public through an IPO, SEO. You know what an IPO is? Initial public offering. So this is when the first time for the company to go from private to public to raise money from the public. SEO is when you are already public and you issue new stock. So for example, a company like Amar is already public and wants to raise more money by issuing new stock. We will not call it an IPO because it's already public. We will call it SEO, seasoned equity offering, for example. So comparing what happens during an IPO, during an SEO, what are the factors that will lead to the success of the deal. All these are research questions that are really valid. We will list them later. And when it comes to the dividend decision, again, we mentioned this, whether to give back the money or whether to retain it. This is the main question. But it has so many dimensions to it. For example, when you decide to give back the money, there are different ways of giving back. Either you distribute dividends, or what are the other ways of giving back the money to the shareholders?
Stock dividends.
Stock dividends, yes. So you can have cash dividends, stock dividends. What else?
Property.
Bonuses, we don't give bonuses to shareholders usually. I'm talking about the owners of the business. Now this is for employees, yes, to motivate and incentivize the employees and the management. But for shareholders, what's the payout? What are the different ways of payout for the shareholders? So basically dividends or
Stocks.
Property dividend.
Hmm?
Also property
stock
dividend.
dividends, but there is another way also.
Non-monetary. Could be non-monetary rewardings, for example.
For
I would
example,
like-
yeah,
I
I
would
would
like-
like to
I would like
hear.
happy to have, for example, like tickets for Ferrari.
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
right. This is
It's
what we
about the
call,
product itself.
it's an in-kind dividend. It exists.
Yes.
Actually, Hollywood Chewing Gum, they give chewing gum to their
I was
shareholders.
gonna say the product itself. that they
Yeah,
are
yeah.
going to give them.
Sorry?
I was going to say the product itself that they
Exactly,
are
the
going
product itself.
Yeah.
Well, if it's chewing gum, I will not, maybe if it's a laptop or, yeah, I would be happy to have
property
it.
dividend.
We had
I know
like
that.
German directors where
Sorry?
they had like we had German directors where in my previous
Mhm.
organization they had like golf membership.
Yeah,
at a
yeah.
senior level, which is like a very prestige, like a top category.
Yeah, it is again a way to incentivize management also or
The
employees.
CEO
Yes.
of Tcom in Dubai, because they are cooperating with Pachi and the Global Village, they take like on an annual basis the VIP parking ticket for Global Village, and all the Pachi chocolate is provided by them, is free for them and the employees.
But this
as
is
well.
for manager, not
This is
for
again for
shareholder.
managers and employees. So here we're talking about how to give back to the shareholders. But what you mentioned is true also. That it exists, the in-kind dividends. So you give a product itself to the shareholders, it exists. So you have three types of dividends: the cash, the stock, and the in-kind dividend. But there is also another way, now maybe it is taking over the dividend itself. It's the buybacks. When the company, or we call it also stock repurchases. When the company repurchases its own stock. This is happening now. I will show you some statistics, even though I have to find the updated ones. That, for example, in US, buybacks and stock repurchases are now higher than dividend distribution. So companies prefer to repurchase the shares rather than giving dividends. So when they have the cash, repurchasing their own shares is also a way to giving back the money to the shareholders.
Which price?
Hmm?
What price?
Market.
The market price.
the
Yes.
current market.
Yes. Why is it preferable? Why it's taking over the dividend distribution? Yes.
Actually, because the U.S. government they lowered the corporate tax rate recently.
Because of some taxation consideration, yes, the way we tax dividend is not the same as we tax how we call it capital gains. So that's one of the reasons why shareholders may prefer stock repurchases to over dividends, because dividends will be included in their tax income tax. Yeah, so it will be taxed differently. And also another reason is actually what happens when you have a dividend distribution for the stock price. What do you think it have? Stock price remains the same, drops, or goes up?
Goes up.
Before it goes up, after it will go down.
When you announce that there is a dividend distribution, at the date of what we call the ex-dividend date, actually, the date at which we decide who is receiving the dividend, who is not, the stock price drops by exactly the amount of the dividend, which makes sense, because if you buy the stock today and you receive the dividend tomorrow, there is a very easy arbitrage to make and to make profit very easily. So that's why it drops by almost exactly the same amount as the dividend itself. So let's say virtually there is no impact. on the price. If you consider, after taking into consideration the revenue that you receive, there is no impact. But if you look at stock repurchases, there is evidence, and it's clear that whenever we announce that there is a stock repurchase, the price will go up. There is a positive signal that the company is standing to the market when they announce stock repurchases. And that's maybe one of the reasons. Again, people are doing a lot of research on this now, on stock repurchases and the differences,
stock
etc.
repurchase?
Stock repurchase is the company buys its own stock. Instead of you are a shareholder, I give you dividend, I will use the cash that I generate, instead of using it to distribute, I will use it to buy the stock.
From the shareholder?
From the shareholders, yes. So this will involve...
But why? What is the reason to do this?
Because again, as I said, the impact will be positive on the price of the stock.
But you're reducing the shareholders.
Because you are giving, you mean the capital?
Yes.
Yes, but you are giving, how we call it, a signal to the market
They have cash.
that you have cash, basically.
So an act of confidence.
Yes, exactly. You are giving a signal to the market, whether it's true or not, we don't know.
Yeah.
But you are giving a signal to the market that you have the cash to repurchase the stock, and the price goes up.
So if this keeps going, you'll end up what? Buying all repurchase?
Well, you will not repurchase all your stock, basically, because you repurchase and you issue new stock, etc. So
Maybe
that is,
you know, it will attract potential buyers for the stocks. صح دكتور?
Mhm.
Maybe you will attract potential buyers.
Exactly. You will, as I said, you there
If
will
I
be
hear this,
exactly.
I will go and
Yeah,
buy
that's
more
why the
stock.
price goes up, because price is an offer and demand. So because buyers will be interested in your stock, because you are giving them, there is two reasons: because you have cash, and because you are giving them a signal that your stock is undervalued. Because when do you purchase stock in general?
It's under the market.
When it's undervalued, right? So you will repurchase your own stock if you believe that it's undervalued,
Go and buy.
and this will be a signal for the market to go and buy the stock as well. Yes.
Doctor, I think, and then they can give the purchased stocks for their CEOs and employees as compensation.
There are mechanisms like this, yeah. There are incentivizing mechanisms related to stocks by giving them the possibility to buy it at a lower price. For existing shareholders also, we give them rights, we issue rights to give them the priority also to subscribe to the new stock, etc., etc. So it could be a combination of mechanisms to both incentivize the existing management and also to pay out to the shareholders, etc., etc. So this is just to explain to you that there are so many mechanisms in the market that belong to each of these categories, and each mechanism can be different in terms of its factors, why we take this direction rather than this direction, and its implications also on the performance of the company, the value creation, etc., etc. So all these again are topics of research. What we do in research, we try to understand the factors, what impacts, for example, higher debt versus lower debt, higher payout versus lower payout, etc. And we also try to understand the implications. If we do this, what's gonna happen? Is the company going to be more profitable? Are we gonna solve some of the agency problems? Are we, for example, if we talk about, again, corporate social responsibility, is it gonna impact positively the performance of the company or not? We do this also for
Yes, the relationship between the CSR and the financing
Exactly.
strategy.
Yes, CSR and financing, for
Yes.
example. If we give the signal to the market that we are doing the right things in terms of CSR, is it gonna be cheaper for us to finance our investments? This is a very valid question, and I think I saw like a paper or two talking about it. So. We can how we call it? We can address this question by looking at, for example, the link that exists between CSR. There are ways to measure the CSR activities in which the company is engaged. If you have higher CSR index, for example, is it gonna make it cheaper for you to raise capital by measuring the cost of capital? There is a way also in finance to measure the cost of capital. So we try to link these two dimensions. So there are lots of ways to address these questions from one of these dimensions, basically. Yeah?
Well, the welfare is one of the assets of the company, and how the welfare can be enhanced by the CSR.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, again, the question is to find how to measure the CSR and how to measure its impact and how to link them together. This is how we implement research. But the ideas are all turned around these topics. Huh? So this is the big picture. I think we can summarize almost every single decision somewhere here in this picture, and I will give you some examples in a moment to finish this introduction, and then we will move to our first topic. So from there, we can say that corporate finance is focused. I want to give you some insights about what is, again, corporate finance about, so that you can locate yourself where your interests stand. So it's focused in the sense that actually it's the big picture I showed you that gives it its focus, because it consists of doing the right things, basically, choosing the right investment, choosing the right mix between debt and equity, and examining the right amount of cash that we should return to the owners of the business. So again, this all relies on the concept of value maximization. If we get rid of this value maximization, we are lost, honestly, and we have to build the whole new framework to be able to work. Okay, we can write it, because there is a difference between just saying, okay, the purpose of the company. If you open any website of a big company and you try to see the mission and the purpose, etc., you will not find a single company that is talking only about value maximization. They will tell you, I don't know, if you open Coca-Cola, making our customers happy and making, okay, all this is valid and it goes in the direction of stakeholder maximization, etc. But how does it fit here? Again, okay? How are we really using this stakeholder way of seeing the business in choosing our investment, choosing our financing, and choosing our payout policy? For example, when we decide how much dividend do we distribute to the shareholders, how are we really catering for all the other stakeholders? Okay?
Through general assemblies, etc.
Yeah, but okay, how? Practically speaking, because we have to again come up with a decision of whether or not we should give dividends and how much dividends. So how can we take into consideration all the other stakeholders when we are making such a decision? I'm not expecting an answer here, but I'm telling you that if you remove the value maximization, then you don't have very accurate answers to all these questions. You have to build a new framework to answer all these questions. Even choosing your investment, you will have so many dimensions to the investment. You have the social dimension, you have the employees dimension, you have. So how do you make these type of decisions in this case? Okay. Yes.
Doctor, you've mentioned in the beginning that it's a group of CEOs who like now begin establishing a new kind of theory of getting away from the maximization.
Actually, I will show you the article.
What happened to them?
I will show you the article. I think it's interesting because it fits really in our discussion. It says at the end that, okay, they come up with this idea, but they are creating more problem than solution, because they kind of, I think it's New York Times article.
They started some kind of related projects in their own companies before they come up with such idea. And then we need to go back to their companies and see what exactly they were thinking about before.
How are we gonna solve these issues? Yes, I think they have to come up with really practical solutions, not just ideas, but practical solutions to all these issues. So let me, this I just American CEO seek a new purpose for the corporation. Corporation. This is Fortune article. I have also articles about finances, and I give this as reading for my students also. A group of CEOs redefines corporation purpose, moves away from the shareholder primacy. This is the Washington Post. And yeah, this one I think is interesting. Making sense of shareholder value, the world's dumbest ideas. Here they call it the world's dumbest ideas to maximize value for shareholders. There are lots of people who are really strongly against this. And this one from the New York Times, shareholder value no longer everything, top CEO says. So let me show you this one. Actually, it was August 2019, and it was
Very
yes,
recent.
It's very recent, yeah. It is very recent.
الشهر اللي ماضي يعني الشهر اللي مضى.
There was an article that says clearly, okay, thank you for this, but now you are making it even more difficult for us, more vague for us, because we don't know what to do then. This is exactly the way it was mentioned.
Have they demonstrated a model or a framework to?
As I said, this question has been debated for so many years now. It's been like since the 1970 when Milton Friedman put it on the table, this discussion. And since then, like, people argue for and against, and now, during the recent years, it's like, again, it's the whole debate about modern capitalism and what we think about it, etc. So one of the foundation of the modern capitalism is value maximization, and that's what we are trying to kind of highlight here. So it's not just, they didn't just think about it last week and they came up with this idea. It's been a long debate for so many years, but it's the first time that CEOs, because researchers used to say this, there was a famous senator last year in US also who raised this issue in the Senate for the first time. She used to be a professor, and she was the first one to dare to raise this issue in front of the Senate last year. And maybe this is the consequence of this debate at the Senate level. And it's the first time that CEOs of major companies in the US make this statement. So this is maybe the important move here, and I think this will probably lead to more thinking about these issues and how we can make cooperation on this.
Doctor, maybe it's because like some debate against the Republicans and Democrats.
Yeah, of course, it is also a political debate. It's you can see from the positions of different parties. It's without entering there, but it can be used as also a political argument for certain parties against other parties. Yes. Anyway, so we move forward. I will post you the articles if you are interested to read about it. Yeah, we said that corporate finance is focused in that sense. Just to wrap up here, it has internal consistency. So all these questions that we were kind of phrasing here are consistent. Consistent in what sense? In the sense that they rest on the same principles. As I said, one of the most important principles in finance is the risk-return relationship. The higher the risk, the higher return. You will find this everywhere in investment decisions, in financing decisions, in payout policy. It's always related. It's always a balance between risk and return. Okay, so this is how we make all the decisions. Cash flows matter rather than accounting income. We mentioned this also. In finance, what matters is cash and not profit. Accounting income is not cash, and that's why we focus mostly on cash. Markets are not easily fooled. This is also a very important idea that links corporate finance to the market, basically. Because when we make investment decision, for example, at the corporate level, even the company is not listed, even if the company is not listed, it's not public, it's private, it could be a family business or it could be a government business, etc. We still have to look at what's happening in the market. Because you mentioned before, one of you, I think you mentioned, or you mentioned, I'm not sure, the difficulty of measuring a hurdle rate, for example. This is one of the most difficult things to do when you are making an investment decision, to come up with your hurdle rate. And this will be even more difficult if the company is not public, because if it's public, it's easy to measure the return for this level of risk, and then you use this internally as your hurdle rate. But if the company is private, how do you find your hurdle rate? Again, even if the company is private, you will refer to the market. Okay, so the market, because why? Because the market cannot be fooled again. It is the best source of reliable information.
It's the indicator for.
It is an indicator.
It's part of
yes.
the equation also.
It is part of the equation, because where do you raise the money from? Where is your money coming from? From the market, right? So investors, even if you're investors, if it's a private business, and at some point you need to raise money, the investors have always the possibility to compare what you offer them to what's there in the market. Okay? So since this kind of arbitrage exists, there is a direct interaction between the corporate world and the financial markets. Okay? And the idea for this to work ideally and perfectly is that markets cannot be fooled. There are different conditions to this. Here we go in the direction of talking about efficient markets, whether the market is efficient or not. Do you know what's the meaning of an efficient market in finance? When we say market, of course.
Free market. Free market.
Maybe it's not the definition, maybe it's one of the conditions that the market is free, okay? Because the more constraints you put on the market, the less efficient it will be, yes? But how do we say that the market is efficient? It is again a condition for this. If you have a market that is more liquid, it is more likely to be efficient. Yeah, more liquid means more transactions happening.
Less insider trading.
Less insider trading, etc. Yes. So actually, efficiency sometimes. If I ask the question, for example, do you think it's easier to make money in an efficient market or in a market that is not efficient? What do you think?
Efficient.
If the market is efficient, it will be easier to make money?
No,
Not
it will not.
Yeah, it's the opposite actually. Usually, if
Easy,
the market is
money,
efficient,
sorry.
it will be difficult.
Exactly.
It will be difficult to make. When I say to make money, it means to make abnormal returns. Okay, something higher than what you would expect. Okay, in this case, the market needs to be not efficient. In a market that is efficient, you will not be able to make abnormal returns.
Okay, are you
Okay.
talking, Doctor, about the institutional governance? How the legal?
Part of it, it's the role of the regulator, and
Yeah.
it is important
the
also.
legal
Yes.
institutes.
Mm.
Okay.
But when I say market here, it's financial markets in general. Whether, for example, the stock market, the
Sorry.
Yes.
So go ahead.
So the idea of efficiency here, because sometimes, actually, the answers I hear sometimes when I ask whether the market is efficient, people think efficient means mature, yeah, or I forgot actually what I always hear. But anyway, efficient market is a market where information is reflected in the prices. Okay, so whenever there is an information, a piece of information, it should be reflected in the price. That's what makes it difficult for you to make extra money, because the information you have, everyone else has it. And it will be reflected instantly in the prices. That's the definition of an efficient market in finance. Okay, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, just would say that I think an efficient market, every company has the real price.
Yes,
in the
the consequence of this, yes, that's correct. The consequence of this is that in an efficient market, the price is what we call the fair price. It's like the true price or the fair price. Okay.
Yeah.
So what are the conditions for this to happen? As you said, we have to have a liquid market. The more transactions are going on, the more efficient the market will be. The bigger the number of players also, the higher the likelihood that it will be efficient. Imagine that you have a small market where 10 or 15 people are dominating the market, they can play with it as they wish. They can make it move up, make it move down, and this is really the opposite of efficient market. Yes.
Just thinking again about this, the inefficient market. Isn't it to make abnormal, let's say,
Abnormality. Yes.
money? Isn't it also risky, very risky?
Yeah, when I say, yeah, you are right. It's a good question. Actually, when I say abnormal return, it means for the same level of risk, we are able to make something extra. Okay, so usually the way we measure it, because again we measure this and we do research on this and we try to see if there is any way to make, for example, you may have heard about calendar anomalies. This is something that has been researched in finance for a long time, where we prove that in certain months of the year or in certain days of the week, we are able to earn a little extra. So when we measure this little extra, we already adjust for the risk, which means we call them risk-adjusted returns. So you are right. If you're taking more risk, you should expect more return. That's a principle in finance. But when I say abnormal, it means after I adjust for the risk, I'm still able to make some extra. This is what we call risk-adjusted abnormal return. Yes.
But being also in this market, inefficient market, is still risky, right?
Yes. Risky in the sense, as I said, it
Because
can be.
you might fall also in this inefficiency.
Yeah, of course, because there could be bubbles in this market that could. So there are, of course, it's a market that doesn't work efficiently. So basically, everything can happen. But again, is it easier to? Is it more likely that you can make easy money? Yes, it is more likely to make easy money in this type of market. But you can also lose maybe a lot also. Yes.
In an efficient market, would there be a lot of black market? Would it happen?
Here, it's not really. What do you mean by black market here? Informal.
Fraud and let's say hidden money transactions not reflected on bank account. Does it happen in an efficient market?
It could be. It could be also linked to maybe poor regulation in terms of all these aspects. But as I said, poor regulation, less investors, smaller market, etc. All these can lead to inefficient markets, and can lead to prices that do not reflect the real value of something. Okay. So why is it important here? It's again, this is a principle here. We are considering that the markets are efficient. So for this to work, but we know that it's not always true again. If we try to link this to, again, the value maximization idea, for example, why is it important to have a market that is efficient? If we think of the decisions, investment decision, you are the CEO, you are making the right decisions, there is no agency problem. Let's really try to be in an ideal setting where you are doing your best to make the right investment decisions. If the markets on the other side are not efficient, what will happen? No matter what you will do, it's not going to affect positively the value of your business, right? Because again, the value does not reflect the fair value, or the information does not circulate like it should be. Okay, so one condition for all this to work also is that the market should be efficient, and there are different ingredients for the market to be efficient. One of them is good regulation to avoid and prevent the insider trading, the money laundering, the different aspects that can make the market less efficient. Other dimensions are more, as I said, the size maybe of the market, how big the market is. That's why, for example, in some countries we try to promote financial markets, stock markets, because we think it's healthy for the economy to have a market that is efficient, right? If you have a bigger market with more stocks traded, with more investors who put their money in the stock market, it will make it healthier for the whole economy. But if you have a small market that is easily manipulated, then of course people will not trust the market, the value will not be reflecting really the information that is there, and all what we'll be doing will not really have any sense, right? Because you can be making very bad decisions, and the stock price is skyrocketing. And it could be also the opposite. You can be doing a great job as a manager, and it's not reflected in the prices. So in this case, you are not able to really play your role of maximizing the value for the shareholders if the market is not working well. Okay, so this just to show you the link. Again, you can tell me here this applies only for a small portion of the economy, especially in emerging markets. You know that only a small portion of the economy is reflected in the market because only a small part of the companies that exist are listed in the market. But I would argue no, because what happens in the market affects also companies that are not listed. Even if the company is not listed, the market represents a source of information. We look at what's happening in the market to know, for example, what is the discount rate, what is the hurdle rate, what's the rate of return we should expect, etc., etc. So it is important that the market functions well. And this is again an area of research where we look at how efficient the markets are there any anomalies in the market? Can we look at some seasonalities? Are there periods of the year where people are able to make more money or less money, etc., etc. So there are lots of research questions related to this as well. And the last principle, which is again our main principle, is that every decision has an effect on its value. This is linked to efficient market. If information is reflected in the price, then it should be the case that everything we do, every decision is reflected in the value. This brings me to an example I gave you before. When you mentioned that bonuses can be tied to the profit, I told you that one way to increase the profit is to cut the research and development expenses, right? So imagine someone, a CEO who does this. Yes, the profit at the end of the year will be higher, but what do you think about, imagine a company that is listed in the market, and you announce, when you are listed, you have an obligation of disclosure. You have to inform, of course, investors about all what you're doing, etc. So you have to be transparent completely. So if you make this announcement that you are cutting your research and development expenses, and people will see it in your financial statements anyway, do you think this will be perceived as a positive signal in the market? No. So most likely, if the market is efficient again, and people are really looking into what you're doing, the price will go down. So you will end up having a high profit, giving bonuses to your manager if your compensation is based on bonuses, and your stock price is going down. So this is exactly what we are talking about here. Every decision should be reflected in the value. Okay, if it's positive, it will increase the value. If it's negative, it will. And we have lots of examples. If you read the news every day, you can see lots of examples where we can see this happening. Sometimes, unfortunately, with some delay. Like this is where you wonder how efficient the markets are when you hear after a few months that of a scandal, and it's affecting, and it has been hidden so far, and all of a sudden it goes public, and we see a drastic impact on the stock prices. This is again maybe problems related to disclosure, compliance, everything else. Yes?
Value maximization of stakeholders, not the shareholders,
Yes.
is probably can be implemented in efficient markets rather than non-efficient markets.
Most likely, because when the market is efficient, again, all the actions are reflected in the price. So, for example, if you are doing something wrong and you are harming the environment, if I take the environment issue, for example, even though you are not harming the value for your stockholders directly, maybe you are thinking of doing something good for the stockholders, the stock price can be impacted negatively by a wrong action, a wrong environmental action. And we've seen examples like this many times when there is an environmental scandal again that happens and the stock price drops in the market. So this proof again that efficient market can also reflect value from a wider perspective rather than the shareholder perspective. It's the stakeholder perspective. Okay. Because the shareholders at the end of the day, who are the shareholders? They're also investors and they are also customers and they are also so they will not be happy to see that you are doing something wrong, especially if you have a very wide base of shareholders. If you are a large multinational and your base of shareholders is very large, then of course it will affect your value, yes, negatively. Okay. Yeah, another idea about finance and corporate finance in general is that it's universal. So this is again from a research perspective, it can be also easy to try to see what's happening in different parts of the world and try to apply it here, for example, because all the principles we talked about, and whether we talk about corporate finance, because sometimes people think corporate finance is only for corporations. Yes, it's true that corporations, when we talk about corporations, we cover a wide range of decisions, etc., that might not be valid for a small grocery shop or for, but the principles are the same. When you talk about risk return, it's valid for any type of business, right? It doesn't need to be a large corporation. It applies to a large corporation, a small enterprise, a startup, a family business, etc. So this is what we mean by universal here. It is applicable to small or large companies, public or private, whether it's based in US, emerging markets. But where we can do research is to look into what are the maybe the specific factors that make the decision different. For example, for an emerging market company compared to a developed market company. So this is why we have an area of research called emerging markets finance. Why? Finance is the same everywhere. But because you are in an emerging market, you will have some specificities. You will look into the problem differently. You will see that it doesn't apply exactly the same. Okay? Same if you are looking into a small enterprise versus a large company. You will have some specific features of small enterprises that will be interesting to research when it comes to financial decisions in particular. Okay, so let's not take too much longer here. Corporate finance is applied in the sense that actually what I like about my area, which is finance, is that it is applied. We cannot talk about gap between the theory and the practice here, honestly. Like I hear always the students saying, yeah, but are we really gonna use this?
Yeah.
In finance, yes. My answer is always yes, you are gonna use it. If you do finance at a high level, yes, of course. But if you are sitting in a branch of a bank doing, I don't know, retail banking or customer service, you will not use all this. But all what we teach you, or what we teach in finance, all the models are really practically applicable and they are applied. Okay, so it is an applied area for sure. And research, the research we do has really some practical implications directly. Okay, we know that all what we do has some practical implications. So this is quite interesting, and even theoretical models. Sometimes you see very complex model, and you wonder whether people apply this. And my answer is yes. I've seen people in the market really, like, especially in very high profile type of jobs for financial markets, etc. They use very sophisticated models and very complex theories. So everything we study in finance is really applied and applicable. Now, maybe you may disagree with this. Corporate finance is fun. Well, it's just provocative, of course. It's because the idea is that, well, finance is numbers, it's boring, we don't like it, it's too complex, too theoretical. But actually, when I say fun, it's numbers, but if you look beyond the numbers and you see the amount of innovation happening in finance, it's huge. It's always, as you mentioned, we had this chat. In finance, we're always talking about the last crisis and the crisis to come. So we still refer to the 2008 crisis. For example, when I teach, I always refer to this crisis, but we always also refer to the next crisis. So there's always something going on. Unfortunately, lots of crises, yes, but lots of innovation also. If you look at the fintech now and all the disruptive role of these new technologies in finance, if you look at the entrepreneurial finance and how things are moving in terms of how new businesses and new ventures are financing their activities, etc., there is a lot of innovation going on. There is always something happening, something new, and I think that's what makes it fun. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Mergers and acquisitions.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Is this still a hot topic?
Yes, it is still, and it will always remain a hot topic. If there is no single day where you don't open the newspaper and you don't hear about a merger and acquisition. Yeah, of course, it is a hot topic, and it will remain a hot topic because, again, it is linked to the entrepreneurial finance also, because part of the maybe exit strategies of investors when they invest in these new ventures, etc., is to be acquired by another big company, etc. So there will be always mergers and acquisitions going on, and we are always interested to see what are the dynamics, what are the implications for the target, for the acquirer, all these things. Yes. So it is a hot topic. Yeah, mergers and acquisitions. I see, for example, the topic I talked about, the cultural aspects. I looked at it from for the fund, the flows, etc., for mutual funds, but there is research going on also on mergers and acquisitions and the role of culture, the role of the culture of the manager also, in terms of mergers and acquisitions can be important. We'll talk about it when we talk about behavioral finance. Yes.
Now in Saudi Arabia, some organizations are not like giving some funds and free money to entrepreneurs for their and they not they giving them loans also. They will tell them that we will buy a share of your like we will invest.
Business, yes.
Yeah, we will invest in your company.
Yes.
And I will give you the right to buy us out.
Exactly.
Once you are ready to do that.
This is typically what happens usually, and this is what we call an exit strategy. So the purpose is not to give free money again. The purpose is to invest and to expect some return out of your investment. So the idea is that even if it's funded by the government, or the idea is to kind of assist those entrepreneurs during the first years, giving them the know-how and the money. But having in mind what we call an exit strategy. What's the exit strategy? Is usually this type of investment, we don't expect to keep it forever. We want to exit this investment after a few years, typically around 5 to 7 years.
Yes.
So after 7 years, what are the different strategies of exit here? What can we do? Either we will, as you said, if usually I would say rarely it's the founding investor who will buy the biggest share. Usually we try to attract new investors because and usually the founding investor himself may be interested to sell because he wants to also cash his investment. Or we can sell either to private investors or to the public through an IPO. So the typical exit strategies are either a private placement with private investors or an IPO in the market where we sell to the shares to the market. So this is the purpose of an investment like this, which is a venture capital investment or a startup level investment. So just to list a few areas of corporate finance that we talked about in our discussion and that you can also pick for your summary. where you can identify some articles. So investment decision, we talked about it. We can link to this also the divestment, the opposite of investment, and the spin-offs when you take the chunk of the company and you sell it out, which is also a kind of divestment. The financing decision, as we mentioned, the dividend decision, and the payout policy, we already talked about all this. Now, related to investment decisions, you have the mergers and acquisitions, you have the leverage buyouts. Do you know what's a leverage buyout?
When you actually combine funds to buy a stake in
An entity, yes.
an entity, yeah.
But by raising a huge amount of leverage, which means by debt.
Yeah.
Actually, it's like a kind of structured financing where we use a lot of debt, a lot of leverage to purchase another business or another entity. And the purpose here is to increase the return through the leverage, so you're not using your own money, and you have to identify the perfect target that will really make this leverage worth it, because of course it's risky also because it's debt, but at the same time, if you target the right companies, then it makes it very interesting. Okay, so this is what we call a leverage buyout. The divestiture, spin-offs, etc. So it's the opposite of investment again. Related to point 2, which is the financing and the capital structure decision, how to issue securities, what are the different steps, what are the factors that will make the IPO successful. We know that we are going now through maybe a cold period when it comes to IPOs all over the world. IPOs used to be very a hot topic so far, with lots of IPOs going on. I remember when I first came here, lots of people were talking about IPOs because they made a lot of money out of these. But now we've been through, since I think 2007 maybe, it's a very cold market. You hear only about very rare or few IPOs.
The recent one
from
was
time to time. Mm-hmm.
the recent case was I shared it with the classmates.
Mm-hmm.
The WeWork IPO. Have you heard about it? The WeWork.
WeWork? No, I haven't. Mm-hmm.
It's actually happening in the US.
Recently.
They want to go public,
Uh-huh.
and because of the CEO's behavior and his lavish life and smoking marijuana on the plane, etc. So they actually postponed the IPO and revised the price because the price was too high. Also.
Yeah, this is very interesting. The timing of the IPO is very important, and every single news. I remember also my student who I said that she did her dissertation with me in corporate governance. When she was finishing her dissertation, she was also expecting to have. She has an executive position at an oil and gas company, and they were expecting to go through an IPO abroad, not here. And all of a sudden the markets went down, and it was really the worst scenario for going public. All the factors were against the IPO, while everything was ready. They did everything, the due diligence, everything was ready. They hired the investment banker, everything was ready, and they had to decide at the last minute not to go for the IPO. And it was really a stressful period for her because she was going
Aramco?
through her dissertation and
Aramco, is it?
no, it's not Aramco, no.
It's here, okay.
Yeah, here, but for an entity abroad, not in the UAE. So they had to cancel the IPO, and they had to go through a private placement with private investors. And just, yeah, exactly. It's the IPO, it's everything can go, it's completely unpredictable because you have to hit the market when all the conditions are favorable, and if the conditions are not, it can be a big failure. Think of, I think, Facebook. It was, they were expecting a huge success, and at the end, it didn't really turn out to be very successful because probably they didn't choose the right moment, or maybe it was the, how we call it, the heat around Facebook was too big that expectations were very high, and here behavioral finance becomes very important also because it's really how people perceive things, what they expect, etc., that will make the IPO successful or not. And it can really have very important damage for the company, for the business, if they don't choose the right moment to go public. So yeah, there are still issues that are important for IPO when we compare to other forms of financing. SEOs, as I said, are seasoned offering when it's not the first time. We can also talk about risk management from a corporate perspective and risk management from a market perspective. So from a corporate perspective, of course, all sources of risk are important for corporate financial decision making. So we can think here of exchange rate risk, for example, the price of oil, natural resources, prices, etc. It's very important also in how it impacts the corporate decisions. Other risks such as corporate governance. Corporate governance is a source of risk, also in how we manage these risks, the practices of corporate governance. So we can also look not only at these three dimensions, but at how they interact with each other. So, for example, the impact of corporate governance on many things. There are lots of papers on this. You can look at the impact of corporate governance on security issues decisions. What maybe is there a link between corporate governance practices and what kind of financing we would choose, whether we would go for an IPO or for an SEO or for other type of financing or for debt. As I said, for example, the disciplinary role of debt is a corporate governance matter. Because if you see debt as a way to bring more discipline to the business, then this maybe can guide your decision to issue debt rather than equity, for instance. The impact of governance on mergers and acquisitions and other corporate restructuring decisions also is important. So is, for example, a good governance versus a bad governance more favorable for mergers and acquisitions? Does it make you, actually we talked about agency problems before, and I told you what are the mechanisms to prevent or to reduce this agency problem. And we mentioned the executive compensation, we mentioned the monitoring, but there is something else also that can be, at least in developed markets, something that reduces agency problem is the threat of takeovers. When managers know that they can be a target for takeover, this incentivizes them without giving them bonuses or private jets. They know that if they don't do what they are supposed to do, they will be easy target, even if you as shareholders you will not see it. There are people in the market who are trying to, identify those bad managers, basically, because a badly managed company is an undervalued company. A company that is not well managed, you know that if you purchase it and you manage it well, you can get a lot of money out of it. So the idea is that bad managers become target for takeovers. That's what happens really in the market. We are looking into who is not doing a great job, and whoever is not doing a great job will jump on his company, we will purchase it, fire him, fire all his team, and do the job properly and get a huge return out of this. So this is exactly one way also to
Hostile takeover.
Hostile takeovers, yeah, these are exactly, hostile takeovers are the nightmare of bad managers because they know that actually they will be an easy target if they're not doing a great job. And it's maybe a market mechanism. It's a mechanism through which the market will protect basically the interest of shareholders, because bad managers cannot offer the luxury, even if shareholders will not notice it. There are other people sitting there who will notice that they are not doing the right, the competitors, all the market analysts, etc. They will notice that there's something wrong, and they will jump on this opportunity to acquire this business. So
maybe one of the board members maybe one of the board members will see the CEO is doing bad, and then he will decide not to have 10% of this company. I will take all of the company and fire him.
Well, I mean, basically the role of the board is to prevent, of course, is also if we are talking about a good governance, this should not happen at the first place, because if you have a good governance, then the board of directors is responsible of what's going on and the decisions that the management is making. And they should be able to notice before anyone else that this is happening. So here we are looking at the extreme cases where the board doesn't play its role, and we can have a lot of literature here. You can read about boards of directors and their composition and whether they are efficient or not, and whether they work or not. I remember I've read some articles where they talk about the composition of some boards of directors of very big companies, and sometimes it makes no sense. You have either people who are retired who come there just to get some money, and some very celebrities, and no one really who is an expert of the area or the management who will be really able to push the alarm button and say there is something wrong. So there are lots of stories about boards of directors and how maybe inefficient they are in dealing with these matters. So are we going to cover all this? The answer is of course no. We are already we are already over the first session and we didn't cover. So I think this was just to give you an overview of first of all corporate finance and the main areas in corporate finance, and how we can in each area identify different research topics by linking them together, by looking at specific mechanisms and specific questions within each of these financial management decisions. I don't think we will start something now, so I will leave it for next class. It will be more focused. I will go through specific items in terms of research. I will give you some facts, so what people say in general, and what is yet to be done in this area. So I will talk mainly, as I said before, I will not focus on investment from a corporate perspective. I will talk about capital structure, so the financing decision, the main ideas of research there. I will talk about payout policy, behavioral finance, and emerging markets finance. Okay, so I'll go through a list of ideas and some references, some authors. So it will be mostly a discussion. Huh? You can go through the slides if you want. I will not cover all of it. Again, there is a lot of information there. It's more for you to get some ideas for your summary, to identify papers. So the sooner the better. If you feel already more comfortable with one of the topics that I mentioned today, you can already start looking for papers. By the way, I guess at this stage you are all familiar with how you search for papers, the library and everything. Yeah?
You provided an Excel sheet, right? For
the Excel sheet,
journal?
these are for the journals to see whether they are ranked A star, A, or as I said, best would be A star or A. B is acceptable if you are looking into something very specialized or very focused in this region, that's fine. So if you have 2 to 3 papers, maybe having 2 A's and 1 B is okay, but having 3 B journal papers, I publish myself in B journal sometimes, there's nothing wrong about it, but it's just, if I publish in B journal, but if I want to get good ideas of research, I go and read the A star journals, because this is where you will have really the good ideas, and then you can take these ideas and apply them. We don't always do top research. It can be something very practical, something very focused in one country, in one region. In this case, it doesn't need to be an A star or an A. You see what I mean? So it's just for you to get some good ideas by looking at the top journals, and then you can also read whatever is available there. I also put you the APA style referencing, so you have to follow the APA style. What else? That's it. If you have any questions, you can ask me next class or send me an email. But try to start already looking into the paper so I can give you my opinion and tell you go ahead, this is a good topic. Because I will be able to see if your choice is coherent. I've seen before, most people come up with interesting ideas, but sometimes, especially if you are not in the area, sometimes I see that it's not going anywhere. I see that the papers are not well chosen. So I will try to guide you a little bit better, so you don't go in many directions. Okay.
كافي،